Everyone. Thank you for joining ICNA Council for Social Justice and World Kashmir Awareness Forum today. My name is Lena Bhatti, and I will be your host for today's event, An Unending Reign of Indian Terror. On August 5, 2019, India revoked Article 370 of its constitution. Article 370 was added after the partition of the Indian subcontinent to give autonomy to the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. 2 years ago, the abrogation of the article prompted a strict lockdown in Kashmir, where communications were blocked out. Non-Kashmiris are now able to buy Kashmiri land and settle in Kashmiri areas. The occupation of Kashmir in India is one that is violent. Kashmiris are left without self-determination and are subject to unjust measures by the Indian state. Today, we have a variety of different speakers speaking on their perspectives on the abrogation of the article and the 2-year anniversary, which was just last week. As you listen to the speakers, please leave any comments in the chat here. We will be answering them in a Q&A after the event. First, we will have Dr. Ghulam Mir speak. Dr. Mir is the president of the World Kashmir Awareness Forum and will be speaking on the work of the organization as well as thoughts on the anniversary of the abrogation. Thank you, Dr. Mir, for joining us.
Greetings and welcome to the second anniversary of August 5, 2019 tragedy. I want to thank the panelists and the listeners for joining us today. I'll first like to say a few words about World Kashmir Awareness. WKAF is an Ohio-based 501c3 nonprofit advocacy organization for Kashmir, focused on informing the public on the Kashmir conflict. We engage with civic, political, diplomatic, and religious organizations around the world to inform the public about the human rights abuses taking place in the Indian occupied Kashmir. We support Jammu and Kashmir's right to self-determination as guaranteed by the relevant United Nations resolutions. I'll defer the scholarly discussion of the Kashmir conflict to the three internationally recognized academic scholars, Professor Athar Zia and Professor Mona Bhan, both born and raised in Kashmir, are with us. Victoria Schofield, an eminent scholar and author from the United Kingdom, will also discuss the details. I will leave the role of diaspora to Mr. Naeem Beg from ICNA CSJ. Naeem Beg is also originally from Kashmir. We are honored to have the speakers with us to inform us and inform the world about the vexing issue and the life and times of Kashmiris under the occupation for the last 74 years. The difficult times they are going through, only they can understand. More so since the 519 Modi made tragedy. A long while ago, our schools in Kashmir, we did not have access to any information about Kashmir, about the Kashmir history, because only the Indian version was taught in the schools. It was the Indian version of history and Indian narrative in the newspapers, in the radio. Of course, other outlets such as Radio Pakistan was completely outlawed in Kashmir, and if you were caught listening to Radio Kashmir, you would be tortured and imprisoned. The freedom movement has deep roots in every corner and all four corners of Kashmir. It has grown from the homeland into the foreign lands around the world. It has, without an iota of doubt, become a diaspora movement also. Mother India, the mother of sloppy fake news in the world, cannot change the facts on the ground and hopefully not in the world around us. Free Kashmir movement cannot be uprooted from the hearts and minds of millions of for a united free Kashmir. It is core at its core. It is principle based, morally anchored, moral struggle. It has to be insurmountable for India to control the desires and the passion of Kashmiris. Prime Minister Modi and his bosom buddy Amit Shah tried it on August 5th, 2019. That was what he thought was his genius masterstroke of revocating the Kashmir status. And look at where we are now. It should drive Indian authorities insane because whatever they had expected is not happening. It only prolongs the misery of the Kashmiri people under colonization, and further, it is sinking the teeming poor Indians into further desperation, poverty, and despair. Obviously, Article 370 of 1954 was an instrument of deceit, just like the fake instrument of accession of 1947 between India and the Dogra Hari Singh, the ruler of Kashmir then. All of the excuses put forward by Modi regime for repealing 370 and 35A are specious and spurious. It is delusional for the Hindu Nationalist Party to hope for the meltdown of Kashmiri resistance. That is not going to happen. It must be abide by the promises made by its original leaders like Nehru, and it must abide by the United Nations resolutions allowing people of Kashmir to be having the right of self-determination. India must obey and implement the relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. It must follow the international law, the UN Charter, and the Geneva Convention. We, the Kashmiris, appeal to the Indian citizens to raise their voices against apartheid state in Kashmir that is in progress. We ask them they should stop pumping millions of Indians to grab and steal Kashmiri land, jobs, natural resources, and administrative authority. We ask them to raise their voices so that Indian government would stop the disenfranchising measures in Kashmir and hold a democratic referendum and resume democracy. We urge the United Nations to condemn the Indian government's policies and actions, including but not limited to the nullifying August 5, 2019 orders, which nix the 370 and 35A guarantees. We call for implementing the referendum under United Nations resolutions. We also want the guarantees that were given to us by the Geneva Conventions and international law and the UN Charter that our rights be respected and Kashmiris be given the right to practice their faith and their culture. We request the Biden administration, and that's my last request, to publicly engage and admonish the Indian government to stop the atrocities, release all of our political prisoners, particularly under COVID situation, and demilitarize the neighborhoods of Kashmir where people are fed up with them and they are at risk. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us, and God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Zia, for speaking on the significance of the World Kashmir Awareness Forum and for going over Kashmiri demands. Now we will have Dr. Athar Zia speak. Dr. Zia is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Northern Colorado. Thank you, Dr. Zia, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lena, and thank you so much, everyone, for organizing this panel. I am going to talk a little bit about the aftermath of August 5, 2019, and then I'll also talk a little bit about international solidarity around Kashmir. I understand I have about 10 minutes, right? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, the event that we are observing today is the completion of 2 years of the militarily and unilaterally removed autonomy of Kashmir in 2019 by the Indian government. And what we need to understand around the removal of this autonomy is a couple of things. And for international audiences, when they had autonomy, it gives an idea that something existed that gave rights to the people, and these were their own sovereign nation. But at the same time, we have to understand that what happened on August 5th, 2019, was completion of the removal of autonomy that had started way back in 1949 when the article was signed into effect itself. So that's something to consider, because otherwise it becomes a before and after situation that India was probably doing something right before 2019, and whatever wrong has been done by the current dispensation. But that's not the case for Kashmiris. For Kashmiris, India has been what it is currently. It's only that before 2019, it was done in a different way. Or let's say before the current dispensation, the right-wing ethno-nationalist fascist party, Bharatiya Janata Party, that is in power right now in India, the way it's doing things, it's more spectacular. They're more unapologetic about what they're doing. So that's something that we have to consider as international solidarity, international discussion, and narratives around Kashmir are rebuilding. The other thing we also have to understand when we talk about internationalization of Kashmir issue, it's not being internationalized, because Kashmir is already an international issue. It is one of the oldest disputes on the agenda of United Nations, along with Palestine. So in that sense, it's already internationalized. So what we're seeing in the current moment is re-internationalization of a dispute that's historical. So having said that, and then I also want to talk about the relationship of Kashmiris with this pact of autonomy, or the special article that existed till 2019 with India. So on one hand, it protected the territorial sovereignty of Kashmiris. It did not allow any Indian to buy land, to have right to franchise, or to have right to property inside Kashmir, which did not mean that Indians did not do business or did not live inside Kashmir, which they did, but there were several impediments to gaining the citizenship or the state subject of Kashmir. So on one hand, Kashmiris saw this article as protective of their territorial sovereignty, but at the same time, there was not the loyalty to Indian, sort of like the establishment of this relationship between India and Kashmir that this article did. So it wasn't as if there was some loyalty to that. There was some faith in that, because we do have to understand, as I said already, from 1949 itself, when this article was signed into effect, it was effectively being eviscerated as well. So what Kashmiris had remained with was a shell of the autonomy that was promised to them under Indian Constitution. And the only thing that was tangible that remained was the territorial sovereignty, which is also called the 35A. And that kind of created impediments to direct settler colonialism from India. Again, saying that it doesn't mean that settler colonialism in different forms did not exist beforehand, which it did. So from August 5th, 2019, now what we see is a brazen settler colonial policies being put into effect unapologetically. There is no discreteness. The other thing that also makes us think about the before and after scenario, like how it has been pretty much the same for Kashmiris from 1947 onwards. One of the secular parties in India, called the Congress, one of the politicians from Congress, he boasted that they had done pretty much the same thing what BJP was boasting about, removal of Article 370. 12 times before they did this. So, and no one had come to know of it. So you kind of know the discreetness with which the previous governments were doing, or whatever discreet is for them. Because for Kashmiris, it never was discreet. It's always been brazen. It's always been a brazen military occupation that has been imposed on Kashmir. And from 1991 onwards, we see apparent laws that are placed in the region which treat every Kashmiris with suspicion, and where dissent, which has been criminalized from 1947 onwards, but which came to fruition after 1991. So those are some of the things that we need to consider before we think, it's not, Kashmiris aren't mourning the autonomy, because it was already done and dusted. It was only nominal. But what they are really mourning is the loss of territorial sovereignty, which is a de jure annexation of their land as it is in this current moment. So that's one thing. The other thing that I also want to say, what exactly has been done after the August 5th, 2019, which is the erasure of the domicile law. So there used to be a domicile law, and now you can have a nominal criteria for Indians to gain the domicile of Kashmir and be a de facto resident inside Kashmir. So that's what's happened, and I don't have the exact statistics, but many, I think it's in thousands now, that domicile statuses are being changed, and people are coming into Kashmir. So that's something that is currently one of the brazen manifestations, and the accompanying other issues are deeply extractive industries that are being set up that are going to attack Kashmir's resources in that sense. But again, we have to understand here that it's not anything new for Indians or the Indian government to start these extractive economies inside Kashmir. It's already been done, and Mona is going to talk about water, and that kind of will give you an idea, and other things that she will be talking about will give you an idea of how extractive Indian economic plans are for thinking about water. One of the things that Kashmiris used to call these projects, these hydroelectric power projects that have been started, is calling them the New East India Company inside Kashmir. So that gives you an idea of what was happening before. And what is happening since. And what we see is extreme dispossession of local populations from the economic enterprises they were involved in. A very minuscule and a very trivial example is sand extraction, which the locals and the local contractors used to do. And now that's being done by non-locals, it's done by Indians. And this is just an example of how jobs are being transferred from locals to non-locals. And this is also happening in employment, in government employment as well. Right now, a salaried class is existent, but the top management inside the bureaucracy, the top management inside the police is non-local Kashmiri. So you can already see, and this was the case before too, but now it's more exacerbated, it's more brazen, and now Kashmiris don't have the rights they used to have as indigenous people. So we do have to understand and consider this as an issue for indigenous rights as well. And then we also, when talking about solidarity, there are many impediments to solidarity for Kashmir. If you look at through the rubric of anti-Islam, or what is also commonly known as Islamophobia. So this is a Muslim population, and we know BJP's agenda. We know that their anti-Muslim agenda that they've had, and we also know how much they have been against, not as BJP, but as RSS and other versions that it had before 1990s. How they have been against Kashmir's special status, and we know they have a brazen anti-Muslim agenda all across India, and that has transferred and has always been their historical part of their historical agenda against Kashmir. So that's also something that we have to consider while we are thinking about international solidarity around Kashmir. Thinking through the rubric of Islamophobia, thinking through the rubric of, India making it into a domestic dispute. From an international dispute, it was downgraded to, to dispute between two countries, to territorial dispute or border dispute, so to speak. Even today, when we speak to people, many of them think that this is a border dispute where the third the most important stakeholder, which is the Kashmiris, they're completely negated. And now India doesn't even consider it to be a two-nation problem. It considers this to be a domestic dispute. And international dispute has kind of gone out of the window. And the other part is Pakistan's proxy war. So all of this is the different variations and iterations that India has kind of used and downgraded Kashmir to mere law and order problem. And in the last 5 years, we've heard this over and over again, that it's only 5 police stations, the regions within 5 police stations, that actually have a problem. The rest of Kashmir is fine. And we also see the reflection of that, how India bifurcated the state into two and downgraded it to a union territory. And right now it is ruled directly by a nominated official who has ties and who is from the RSS party, a colleague of Modi. So that's the person who is a de facto ruling official right now from the Delhi government. So these all point to what scholars and what activists and Kashmiri the well-wishers have been saying all along, that India is playing the politics of democracy inside Kashmir. It's weaponizing electoral democracy. Otherwise, this is a military occupation. And before it was a de facto occupation, but after 2019, and the way different laws and the way different kind of pacts between India and Pakistan, especially the 1971 Shimla Agreement, has been flouted, it has become a de jure occupation. So that's something that we have to, when we're thinking about solidarity around Kashmir, we have to think about that, and we have to take this argument to people that this is a genuine movement. This is not, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, the stereotypical Islamic terrorism that is, even today as we speak, there is a diktat from the Indian government that the journalists should not use the word militant, which they had chosen as a neutral word, but they should replace it with terrorists. And the other thing that they're doing as we speak today, because 15th August is coming, which is India's Independence Day, they're changing the names of public schools after the killed military personnel or any police personnel that have been killed in their encounters with the militants. So, those kind of there is direct military imperialism. And then on the other hand, you have cultural imperialism. That is, both of them right now, they're on steroids in Kashmir. And it's not just the fear of settler colonialism, but it's actually facing these processes of settler colonialism and its policies. And I think that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zia, for speaking on the aftermath of the abrogation and for providing more context on the perceived autonomy of Kashmir. Next, we will have Dr. Victoria Schofield. Dr. Schofield is an author, biographer, and historian who has over 30 years of experience covering South Asia. Thank you, Dr. Schofield, for joining us.
Thank you so much. And hello to you all from the United Kingdom. I hope you can hear me and that my connectivity is all right, as I've had a little bit of problems and it's now pouring with rain. Yeah, so it's been slightly difficult. I haven't been able to hear everything from the last speaker, Dr. Zia. I'd like to thank you, Lena, and also Dr. Ghulam very much indeed, and the World Kashmir Awareness Forum for having me on this panel. It is a subject which is very close to my heart, and as you rightly say, I have been following this issue for the past 30 years, at least. Actually, I first went to the Valley of Kashmir in 1981, and I feel very privileged, actually, to be talking about the subject because I am a foreigner. I'm a British writer and journalist and historian, and I always think it's very important to recognize that it's not my struggle, it's the struggle of other people, the inhabitants of the land. At the same time, I've been very privileged to meet so many of them, to travel in the region, and to take their issue to my heart as a field of study. What I've been asked to talk about is the abrogation of Article 370, Will Modi's final solution, as it said, of Kashmir conflict work, and to give some thoughts on the 2-year anniversary since the abrogation on 5th of August 2019. I want to make a few points, and I think it's very difficult because obviously I'd like to be optimistic. I'm not pessimistic either, but I think one has to be realistic. And 2 years after the abrogation, I think what we have to take on board is that the government of India thinks it's got away with it. It's certainly acting in a manner to carry on in the way that it has. There hasn't been any remorse. There doesn't appear to have been any statement at all which shows any feeling that maybe it didn't do the right thing. I think we have to look at this as a government action which believes that this is the way forward for Kashmir. And this is very apparent in everything that's happened since then, because they've been continuing along the path of attempting to integrate Kashmir into the Indian Union. It's still only a union territory. There's been talk and promises of reverting to its status as a state, but that hasn't also happened. But what I do feel, especially when you're addressing the international community and trying to gain the support from the international community, is that this issue is complex, and we know it's complex. Certainly, I know it's very complex, having studied it for so long, that and we have to explain that to the international community, because otherwise they find it too difficult to grasp and too difficult to speak on behalf of. And so if one's exhorting government leaders from President Biden or indeed Prime Minister Boris Johnson or any other world leader, it has to be clear what actually is the issue. Now, to you all, you know what the issue is. It's an issue about self-determination and the rights of individuals. But when you go back into the history, as I've done, and one talks about the United Nations resolutions, one has to understand we are using Kashmir as a shorthand. We talk about the Kashmir issue. I've myself called my book The Kashmir in Conflict, Kashmir in the Crossfire. But when you start unpicking the issue, you have to realize that it's an issue which concerns peoples of the state, the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, and that includes the inhabitants of Jammu. It includes the inhabitants of Ladakh, and also what, as we know, forms politically the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir is the Gilgit-Baltistan region. It's the narrow strip of land which in Pakistan is called Azad, free, Jammu and Kashmir, but which the Indians continue to call Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and their provocative statement saying that they intend to get back POK, as they call it, and Gilgit-Baltistan and bring it back within the Indian Union, shows how far apart both countries are in terms of conflict resolution. If anything, they're further away from conflict resolution than they've ever been. And again, as a historian, I go back to the various talks that have been held. We know there have been countless talks about holding talks that never achieved anything, that turned into stalemate. 1962-63 talks. Think how it would have been had those talks succeeded. But when you are talking about talks, you have to be clear what you're talking about. What could be the end game? What could be conflict resolution? And I think this is why many people are very disappointed by the reaction of the international community, because they haven't really grasped these complexities. And so if we are going to talk about conflict resolution, which I passionately believe in, because one of the tragedies of this issue is it's been handed from one generation to the next generation. And I've said this often in seminars I've been addressing and fora, that I'm now talking to students and people of the next generation who weren't born when the Kashmir insurgency began in the Valley of Kashmir in 1989, 1990. These young people now, it's been going on for 30 years. Equally, all these young people have known nothing other than conflict, those people living in the Valley of Kashmir, where, as we know, the main area of disaffection and alienation is. And so we owe it to the next generation not to pass it on to them to resolve. And it's certainly true, I would say, that one can't just look at the issue and say, well, it'll just get better, because if anything, it's got worse. It's got more dangerous. You're sitting with India and Pakistan, both nuclear neighbors, both threatening hostilities with each other. And who knows what could happen. And as we know, war never resolves an issue. It actually creates more issues. And so I think conflict resolution is imperative. And it's even more imperative because until you have conflict resolution, you're going to continue to have human rights abuses. And I think foremost in discussing the abrogation and what's happened in the Kashmir Valley, which is as we know, the heart of the issue, you're going to continue to have these human rights abuses. When you've got a military occupation, you've got the absence of the rule of law. I don't have to relate all the statistics because one death in custody is too many deaths. One torture, one orphan, one missing individual. But we know there are thousands. Again, it's hard to say because statistics vary, but in the region of 70, 80, 90,000 people have died since this insurgency began. And so one should say enough's enough. So whenever one condemns human rights abuses, I think it's important to say they'll continue until we can look at this end game, until we can look at conflict resolution. And I would agree that it's very difficult to see where that conflict resolution could take place with the current government in India. I also take Dr. Zia's point that this is not a new before and after situation, 5th of August 2019, pre and post. This has been a gradual process of incorporation, which has been going on since the 1950s. And again, this is why I think knowing the history is so important, because parachuting in at certain dates doesn't give you the full picture. But I believe firmly that dialogue is essential. And I think keeping abreast of the issue, understanding what the issue is, understanding what could be the end game, and most importantly, foremost is the aspirations of the inhabitants of this land, this beautiful land. Why should they live in trauma? And I think, as I say, the majority of the youth now have grown up in conflict. Unreported are the statistics of stress and trauma which the young experience because they've grown up in conflict. And again, if you've been privileged to go to the Valley, as I have, even before 2019, and meet the young students, the school children, you think how the atmosphere on a college campus in the United States, or indeed in the United Kingdom, notwithstanding the difficulties we've all had with the COVID pandemic. But then you think about the difficulties of students in a campus or a school in the Valley of Kashmir, where they never know if they're going to go to school the next day because they never know if there's going to be a lockdown or a curfew. The difficulties of encouraging students of the value of study. As we all know, we sometimes have to motivate our own children to study, but the difficulties for them, they deserve all the rights and liberties that we in the Western world, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Europe have to lead our lives in what one would say traditionally from the American Constitution, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's so this is the important point. So I come back to the original statement. Has Modi's final solution, I don't actually like to use that term because that relates really uniquely to the Holocaust, but it's the title of this topic, worked. I think it hasn't worked because it hasn't got the agreement of the people and the acquiescence of the people. And until a solution is found which has the acquiescence of a representative grouping of the people, it will never work. And you'll continue to have this back and forward, curfew, crackdown, a death, a funeral, a protest. And that is no way for people to lead their lives. So my short answer to this is no, it hasn't worked. It's been 2 years since the abrogation of Article 370 and 335A, but it's been done by force. And anything done by force will not endure. And so just as my opening comments, I hope I haven't overstepped my time, I'd just like to leave you with these thoughts of thinking about what this end game could be, what could bring conflict resolution in accordance with the aspirations of the inhabitants of this land. And we have to take the whole land, the state of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, because that's ultimately what is in dispute if you go back to those United Nations resolutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Schofield, for your thoughts and perspective. Before introducing the next speaker, as a reminder to those watching, please leave your questions in the comment box so we can answer them after everyone's done. So next we will have Dr. Mona Bhan joining us. Dr. Bhan is a cultural anthropologist and professor of anthropology at Syracuse University. Thank you, Dr. Bhan, for joining us. I think you're muted, Dr. Bhan. Dr. Bhan, your mic is muted.
Thanks for the reminder. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to build on what my co-panelists have already discussed I think, in great length, but just add a few more empirical details perhaps from the ground, so we know the extent of transformation that is underway as we speak. So we know my work has been on economic development and ecological sovereignty issues in Kashmir for over 20 years. I've also worked on border wars among communities along the border, and worked with agro-pastoralist communities. And I feel that's a perspective that often gets overlooked in what's been happening for the last so many years, for decades. But more recently, because of a slew of changes in land laws that were mentioned very briefly by my colleagues. So as we know, a key justification for the abrogation was that the abrogation of 370 and 35A would usher in a new dawn in Kashmir and basically allow economic growth and development to happen pretty much at par with what was happening in other Indian states. And of course, this was happening in the context of an unprecedented communication blackout, when people were caged inside their homes, and of course, their voices were completely squashed. So there was no way to know what stakes they had in the sort of rhetoric of economic development. And this was also when Indian investors had started, of course, meeting in other cities of India to discuss mining, hydroelectric, real estate, housing, tourism projects for Kashmir. And of course, not to forget what Athar reminded us was that this is not something new, this idea of development and using development to domesticate the Kashmir dispute has been ongoing for the last decades, so many decades, even under the Congress. So for example, this discourse of alienation that we kept hearing, that once people's economic needs were taken care of, once their livelihood needs were taken care of, then we would see somehow the resistance Kashmiris expressed towards India, that would dim automatically, that would be taken care of. So this discourse of alienation also has been used, I would argue, as a way to domesticate the dispute, to undermine its international dimensions, and to show repeatedly, both to India and to international audiences, that all you need really is a dose of development to fix this political, what is foundationally a political issue. And this, we know, this discourse of development was wielded by the BJP government to, of course, legitimize the abrogation. But this was also happening, and now we know this from so many, empirical studies that have been done just this last 2 years, that Kashmir, compared to other Indian states, had routinely performed much better on many different indices, such as education, poverty, life expectancy, and wealth distribution patterns. So this was clearly then a myth of underdevelopment, this colonial caricature of a Kashmiri being economically backward and dependent on India's largest to survive. But beyond that, I've argued in my work previously that the the myth of development is sort of a foundational myth. And why do I say that? It's because for the longest time, this myth of development has been used to prop up India's secularism, right? Under the Congress, it was meant to prop up India's secular credentials because, Kashmir is what made India, quote unquote, secular. And likewise, this myth is now being mined in to prop up a Hindu majoritarian government with the same intent in mind. So it hasn't quite mattered what the process of implementing or using this foundational myth has been, because the myth has sustained across regimes, right? So there's these continuities that we see across regimes when it comes to talking about Kashmiris as this dependent population, as I said before, that would not be able to survive without Indian beneficence. So clearly then development or this rhetoric of development has already allowed a range of experiments over time. But of course, under the Modi, under BJP's regime, now since 2014, but of course since 2018, August of 2019, development has clearly become a way to depopulate this area of Kashmiris, or use development as a tool to exterminate local communities, bring in Indians from elsewhere and settle them in these territories. So essentially what it has sanctioned is what scholars and academics are now been writing about, is the settler colonial project. It has cemented the settler colonial project of India, and to an extent, development, of course, has been used to legitimize that particular project. So because of that, there have been a range of changes in certain land laws, and I just want to quickly speak to a few because I feel that brings out the actual situation as it's changing on the ground. Because these land laws, the changes in the land laws is really ushering in at a rapid scale people from outside, but also dispossessing and disenfranchising local populations. So, for example, the JK Industrial Development Act was recently modified, and what you have now is the possibility that there will be a Jammu and Kashmir Development Corporation set up. Local journalists have called this kind of a corporation, when and if it comes into fruition, it could be stronger than the East India Company because it has such unilateral powers to possess land, to forcibly acquire land from local populations and impact people's abilities to utilize their land for agricultural purposes even. So there are other laws, for example, the revenue laws that have changed now that allow the government to deem or transform agricultural land into non-agricultural land. So it could mean anything. It could mean you could set up industries, corporations, you name it, cinema halls even, on land that was primarily meant for agriculture. And this is a huge thing because if you look at it, agriculture is about food justice. It's about food sovereignty. It's about people's abilities to produce their own sustenance. And once you take that away, once you take land away, we know that you're undermining people's abilities to live autonomously, live in dignified ways. So that's part of it. The other big law that was changed was the Big Landed Estate Abolition Act that was repealed. And this is what allowed land, when it was passed, decades ago, it allowed land to be distributed equally among populations in Kashmir. And that's one reason why Kashmir, of course, we know this now, was doing relatively better compared to other states where land laws were not as just and as equitable. But now with that gone, with the Big Landed Estate Abolition Act repealed, what you're essentially allowing is, these big landholders to come in and exploit these changes and transform vast segments of land into commercial property. And this is based on the report that just came out on the anniversary of the abrogation, the second anniversary of the abrogation. I think it was entitled, it was something about how Kashmir is speaking a different tune, something along those lines. And one sentence that really struck me from that report was how what the abrogation had done was establish one nation, one constitution, one flag, and one market in Kashmir, and sort of brought Kashmir into the fold of this singular homogeneous market that's pan-India. And that's deeply concerning, because what it really allows for is clearly this corporatization of Kashmir's resources, and this corporatization happening, of course, at the helm of this already extensive militarization of land and resources, including water, that if I have time I'll speak about. So that's already happening quite a bit. I also want to speak to this concern of agro-pastoralist groups, or pastoralist groups in particular, the Gujar Bakarwal community, for example. So one of the key laws that was repealed by the High Court in 2020 was the Roshni Act. So this Roshni Act allowed, this was the Jammu and Kashmir State Act. It was passed in 2001, and it allowed state land to be owned by the occupants legally after they paid the state some, whatever amount the government decided that it needed. So people could pay that amount of money and legally own that piece of property. And the idea was that money that would be generated from this sale would eventually help hydroelectric powers. That it would fund hydroelectric projects in Kashmir. Now, according to the Hindu right, for the longest time, the Roshni Act was considered to be this very well-knit conspiracy of Muslims against Hindus in Jammu in particular. So a lot of this Roshni land, more of it is in Jammu than it is in Kashmir. And a lot of these statistics were dredged up to substantiate why this was what the Hindu right called land jihad, which was essentially that, this Roshni Act was a very, as I said, conspiratorial scheme created by the J&K state to legally allow a demographic shift of Jammu from its predominantly Hindu to predominantly Muslim habitation. And in this High Court 2020 order, you see, if you read the order carefully, it is very interesting that state land, which was not considered to be in public trust until then, is now seen as belonging to public trust, like air, like water, like lakes, and other common property. And the idea was, and in this new law, in this kind of the High Court order, it is claiming that the state government has deliberately created this law to loot public land. And the interesting thing is, of course, this was, I'm not saying there is not elite abuse of land in Kashmir. That might be the case, but that's pretty much everywhere you look, that is indeed the case. But it's also the case that a lot of people who had been able to utilize this land, they were also a lot of Gujar community, the pastoral Muslim community, almost 1.5 million population. And they were the ones who benefited tremendously from this act in the past. So a lot of these people, so what I'm trying to say is legally, the landscape has shifted quite a bit on the ground, and there are people protesting still, right? Legally, constitutionally, using juridical routes to assert, for example, that a lot of these petitioners who were beneficiaries of Roshni land are stating that, we're not looters, we are not trespassers. Because we've been now declared to be trespassers, and that is a criminal offense, and we can be tried in the criminal court. for things that were absolutely legal up until a month ago. So what's happened is this very sort of an interesting shift. And what the government did at the time was also say that there was going to be a CBI inquiry to see how much land had been appropriated by Muslim populations or illegally by Muslim looters. But it so happened that a large proportion of this land, at least in the Jammu region, ended up benefiting the Hindu population of Jammu and not the Muslim population. And then, the case was dropped, and we haven't heard much about what's next on that agenda insofar as the appropriation and reclamation of Roshni land is concerned. How much time do I have? Can anyone quickly?
Yeah, just a couple more minutes.
So quickly to that, associated with that is this Forest Act, the Forest Rights Act. So Gujar communities, in general, communities in Kashmir were not granted the forest rights. They were not granted forest rights like in other communities in the Indian state that the Indian government had allocated to its populations. And the idea was that until 370, we could not apply some of these central government regulations in Kashmir. But the thing is, there are other central government, and this is what a lot of local journalists in Kashmir have been crying hoarse about, that, there were other central government schemes, such as the NREGA scheme, the National Food Security Act, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. I mean, all these are central government acts that were extended to Kashmir, but why wasn't the forest rights extended, and why did we need to abrogate 370 to then extend the Forest Rights Act in Kashmir? And this is where I think we have to understand this kind of a logic of the logic or the legitimation that's used by the government, the Hindu right government, to say that we are now extending the rights to Kashmiris that they did not have before because of this the impediments that were created by 370. But those impediments were seen to be seen very selectively. There were certain things that were seen as impediments and others were not. So the Forest Rights Act was not implemented, but the Prevention of Terrorism Act was. So the justification that a lot of these journalists, especially from marginal border communities, they are constantly arguing that, why wasn't the Forest Rights Act already implemented in the region when these other draconian acts were? And even so, even though now the government is claiming that there is this Forest Rights Act that will basically allow communities who thrive, who depend on forests, to not face evictions, to access forest land and resources, so on and so forth. That law has not been fully implemented to this day, even though there are these kind of claims, the tall claims that are being made that eventually these laws will be extended to Kashmir to preserve the rights of minorities and so on and so forth. The last thing I want to talk about quickly is how all this struggle over land is ultimately linked with this question, very fundamental question about Kashmiri citizenship. Because questions of land sovereignty and citizenship cannot be delinked. So it's very important that we recognize that land in Kashmir, or for that matter, in many, many places, but more so in Kashmir, because land has always been such an important, integral part of people's identity and claims to a particular kind of an identity. So in Kashmir, this question of land, therefore, it's not just about giving you empirical details, but also to assert the fact that questions of land and citizenship are intertwined. So what happened, for example, with the abrogation of 370 and this parceling out of land to non-Kashmiris, along with that, the domicile question that Athar briefly mentioned becomes an important one. So, for example, there are 4.1, according to most recent reports by the government itself, 4.1 million domicile certificates have been issued in the region. And that includes around more than 55,000 to West Pakistan refugees. Now, that's all fine and good. Again, this discourse of equipping people with fundamental rights to be citizens in Kashmir is all good. But at the same time, what the government has also done is repealed the Resettlement Act of 1981, which allowed Muslim refugees who'd left, who were forcibly driven out of Jammu, the Jammu region, from after partition from 48, to return to Kashmir, to reclaim their right to citizenship, to reclaim their right to land, Kashmiri land, and so on and so forth. And these are people. There were around 237,000 Muslims who were systematically exterminated from the Jammu region. And this happened in 1947, but that sort of started a trail of displacements from 47 onwards until 54. And the Delhi Agreement Act recognizes their right to return to Kashmir. But now, because of many different laws that have been abrogated under the J&K Reorganization Act, one of the laws that was abrogated was this right to return, or the Resettlement Act of 1981, that allows these Muslim refugees to return to Kashmir. So we have to then recognize that on the one hand, we are allowing West Pakistan refugees, who majority of whom are Hindu, we are allowing them citizenship rights. They're non-Kashmiris, but we're not allowing Kashmiris their citizenship rights. And it goes back to what Dr. Schofield mentioned, that when we think about Kashmir, we have to think of the entire territory, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. So what's being done, therefore, through these land laws, the enactment of these land laws, is precisely, I argue, challenging people's right to be citizens of this territory and this home. And that is, of course, all happening to undermine Kashmir's status as an international dispute, but also to of course, prepare the grounds, if it ever comes to be that there's a referendum in the future, then prepare the grounds for skewing the outcomes of that referendum. So that's what I kind of want us to, I want us to think about and leave with, is all these laws, land laws, that are shifting the ways resources are being utilized or misutilized or misused and extracted and appropriated, all eventually connects to questions of belonging and citizenship for Kashmiris. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhan, for that overview. For our final speaker, Mr. Naeem Beg will be joining us. Mr. Beg is the former president of the Islamic Circle of North America, and he is also currently a board member of ICNA CSJ. Thank you, Mr. Beg, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulil Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. I begin in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and may His peace and blessings be upon Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I thank you for this webinar, Kashmir World Awareness Forum, and ICNA Council for Social Justice for organizing this webinar and keeping us all informed and aware of what's going on. It's been 2 years, and still atrocities by the extremist Indian regime has not stopped in Kashmir, and persecution is still going on. People are still suffering, but unfortunately, because the whole world for the last almost now year and a half or going to 2 years, just all suffering from COVID-19, unfortunately, when it comes to the human right abuse that is happening in Kashmir or in some other parts of the world, generally not in the mainstream media as they should have been, and so these forums, this conversation is extremely important, and especially for those of us who would like ourselves to be involved and engaged when it comes to issues of social justice, issues that are affecting people in Kashmir or people in Palestine or in other places in the world, that we must be fully involved and engaged while we are all suffering from this pandemic. When it comes to I was asked to just speak briefly on the aspect of diaspora and advocacy for Kashmir. For when we think about diaspora, I think we are not only talking about just the Kashmiri American community or Kashmiri community, but we're talking about the generally Muslim community, immigrant Muslim community, local Muslim community, and also people of conscience, people who are not afraid to stand up when it comes to standing against oppression or injustices wherever it is happening. And there is definitely there is much more ask from those of us that who have maybe our some links to Kashmir through our family or our friends. But at the same time, it is a human rights issue. It is a clear aspect where the extremist Hindu government has taken on these additional measures to further eliminate the Kashmiri community. The marginalization is happening to the extent that people are not able to breathe, as free people, as God Almighty has created us. So, what is our responsibility? And that it starts with, when we think about advocacy, do we believe in the cause? And if we believe in the cause, then we must be restless. Then we must not, it's not just picking up a phone here and there and making a call, but it is, what can I do? It is an ask that I see myself and our community, that yes, when it comes to issue of Palestine, we are sensitive to that. Even if we are not Palestinian, we are Muslim, and even if we are not Muslim, we practice other faiths, Christian, Judaism, other faiths, but the world is much more aware of the atrocities that are happening, oppression that is happening in Palestine. And when we look at the history, the Kashmir, about the same, over almost 75 years of oppression that people are facing in occupied Kashmir. And even before that, my own grandparents, they had to migrate from Kashmir. But when we think about issues of Palestine, much more mainstream. Muslim community is much more aware of it. But when it comes to issue of Kashmir, people know now. I remember when a few years back, we used to make dua for Palestine and rarely Kashmir. But now, alhamdulillah, when it comes to Jummah khutbas and most khatibs will mention occupation of Palestine and occupation of Kashmir. But we need much more than that, and that is where when it comes to our role and responsibilities, it is not just occasionally going to in front of the UN or going in front of the White House and demonstrating, but it requires from all of us that we must engage in an advocacy that is consistent, that is continuous, and that an advocacy that is making is holding people responsible, our own politicians, holding them responsible for not taking action against India, for not taking action that we witness, that killing fields, mass graves, using rape as a weapon. These atrocities are taking place, and we must make our politicians, our leadership, we must make them responsible for staying silent, for still seeing India as the largest democracy, for still supporting Hindutva in India for not saying anything. When they're not saying anything, they're supporting Hindutva. They are supporting RSS regime, and they are supporting all the atrocities that Indian government is committing against people in Kashmir. So for us, advocacy begins with becoming restless. Advocacy begins with, what can I do? And there are a few things that we are now we are hoping that our Muslim community. We also have in the U.S. an umbrella Muslim organization, USCMO. ICNA Council for Social Justice is a member of USCMO. And alhamdulillah, slowly and slowly, we are coming together to address these issues, which are domestic issues, but also which are issues that are affecting our community. And that's where, regular engagement, not within the Muslim community only, but also seeking partnerships from outside. And that requires, or we can look into the interfaith organizations that are almost every major city, small city has an interfaith body. Can we become a member of that local interfaith body, and seek support and help from other faith groups? And I can tell you, my brothers and sisters, that because there is a lack of information, most Americans do not know what is happening in Kashmir. And I think with these efforts, when we'll be reaching out to our interfaith partners, friends, having a conversation on this topic, you will find that people are going to stand up with you when it comes to human rights, when it comes to religious freedom, when it comes to people giving them the freedom of choice. So engaging in interfaith coalitions and organizations, a major support that Palestinian cause gets is from the college campuses. So we do have Muslim student associations almost in all major institutions, educational institutions. So that is another aspect, engaging young people, having a conversation with young people on this topic. They will provide the energy to this cause, inshallah. The other aspect is that right here in our country, there are OIC member organizations. So seeking out, having a conversation with the member organizations, OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and asking them, holding them responsible for their inaction in most of the cases. There is not much action that they have taken. So seeking meeting with OIC, and also providing regular briefing papers to the new administration. Alhamdulillah, we just heard the nomination of the ambassador at large, Muslim Rashad. So maybe that's another area that we can work and seek out support from the Biden administration. And the awareness in the larger Muslim community. When 2 years ago we did sought help from khatibs, Muslim leadership, in informing the community about Article 370 and the atrocities that are taking place. But there are many more things that I learned today as well from our presenters, that the grabbing of land is still taking place, and other things that are still happening in Kashmir. So making it more frequent when it comes to informing the Muslim leadership and seeking their help in delivering Friday sermons, Friday khutbas on this topic. So inshallah, with this, as I said before, that this advocacy requires continuous effort. ICNA Council for Social Justice has been organizing different virtual programs, a virtual human chain around UN. So things like that, inshallah, will will keep this issue alive and relevant, and also finding ways that we are able to reach out to the larger society by building coalitions and seeking partnerships. May Allah help us in our work, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to offer our resources for the brothers and sisters suffering in Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baig, for your thoughts and perspective. We'll now start the question and answer portion of the event. This is a reminder to, again, please leave your questions here in the comments. First, for Dr. Mir, I wanted to ask you what the role of Indian citizens is in the occupation of Kashmir as someone who has grown up in Kashmir, and what should they do to support Kashmiri self-determination?
Well, thank you very much for the question. The Kashmiris in the United States and Europe in general, like it was said by Mr. Naeem Beg, I think we do need to, number one, unite. Because what India is trying to do right now is trying to create friction between different generations and different groups of people, Kashmiris. They have been targeting our youth with their false propaganda around the world, and one of those fake news items came to ground, the fourth about only last week. And what they're trying to do is identify individuals and organizations for what legitimate work they are doing for Kashmir and highlighting the plight of Kashmiris. So first thing to do is to unite, because they are going to divide us and they're trying to conquer us. So Kashmiris, whether we are fearful of Indian pressure, Indian occupation there, committing pressure tactics on our families there or not, and whether they will allow us to go back to Kashmir or not, or whether they'll torture our relatives, brothers and sisters and parents, regardless of that, I think Kashmiris have to unite together, because they are going to target us regardless. Might as well face them and fight against that, and go to the American authorities, the British authorities, and ask them that they are targeting us. If that's what they're doing in the West, imagine what they must be doing against the people who are living within the within India or in Kashmir. And so I think backing off is not a solution going forward. Is there a risk in it, a personal risk, personal sacrifice? Yes, it is. But that's where courage comes. And Kashmiris living in Kashmir have been doing it for decades. We did it when we were teenagers, and we have continued to do it now that we are in our 60s, 70s. And giving up is not an option. And we also see Professor Victoria Schofield, we have Athar Zia here, we have Mona Bhan. Imagine the amount of information we got today. I learned a lot. It's easier to learn from the teachers rather than just read. So I think we need to come together and have organized conferences and rallies like the ones we have been doing and today. And also when the UNGA conference comes in this year, I think we should have a huge rally in New York. And I think everybody that supports Kashmiris, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Hindus, Sikhs, everybody should come to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's very important to increase the visibility of Kashmiri voices. For Dr. Schofield, I wanted to ask, you spoke about the role of the other areas that existed in the former princely state. So I wanted to ask, how do the roles of those other areas affect the occupation of the Kashmir Valley itself as of today?
Well, it's a very good question, because, as I say, and what I've been trying to demonstrate from an international perspective is this is one of the issues that confuses the international community and also stops them in a way in adopting it. And I take Naseem Beg's point about Palestine. Palestine is sort of a mono issue. It's a homogeneous issue where people have understood it. You're either for or against, but it's kind of more comprehensible. But when you point out to people, you know, that there are human rights abuses going on in the valley, but the valley is only a very small part of the actual former princely state, which is what forms the dispute and which is what's lodged in the United Nations and what the resolutions are about, then it becomes more confusing. And that's why you have to present a uniform picture, and you have to have a united kind of cause, because clearly people in the other parts of the state, although it's called the state of Jammu and Kashmir, we shorthanded into talking about the Kashmir issue, but actually it also includes the inhabitants of Ladakh. So they also have a right to have their aspirations addressed. So do the people in Jammu, so do the people in Gilgit-Baltistan, and so do the people in Azad Jammu and Kashmir. And this actually is nothing new. So Owen Dixon, the Australian jurist, in 1950 identified the difficulties of this, what he talked about, sort of a diverse area, but that's united under the name of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And so this is why, as I say, you can't have a quick fix solution, but you have to have a dialogue which addresses these aspirations. But most importantly, you have to stop the human rights abuses in the Valley of Kashmir. And this is the area which is being targeted, but this is what's been easy for the Indian government, because, as I say, it's been obfuscated by the actual complexities of the issue. One thing I would like to point out, and also in response to Naseem Beg's comment just now, is that I think the narrative about India is beginning to change. I totally agree that, you know, in the Western world, we talked about India as the world's largest democracy. But I think for more informed people, they are beginning to see through that. And that is also partly our responsibility as activists, as commentators, as journalists, as writers, is to make people look at the small print. It's as I say, India has been quite successful in capturing that narrative, but it's our responsibility in seminars such as this also to say, wait a minute, this is actually not the case. Look at the situation. Look at what's going on. I've had even, you know, my Kashmiri friends, they say, oh, well, you know, when you talk about India, you think of big business and yoga and lovely country. But that's our responsibility. And I think also in terms of human rights abuses, we must look to the UN 2 reports that were produced in 2018 and 2019. These are important documents which we need. They're easily accessible now on the internet. We also need to highlight to people to concern, you know, whether it's congressmen, senators, members of parliament, members of the European Union, to say, look, read these reports. These are impartial reports. These are factual figures. And we must make use of these figures so that people understand it's not just a rhetoric, it's not just propaganda that we're trying to put forward. Use the tools that are out there. Use what has been written by people, by impartial observers. One of the reasons why I've spent, as I say, so many decades is that I've written, I've spoken, I've updated my own book 5 times, in fact, in order to try and present the reader with the situation so that they can then make up their mind about what's going on and then become activists themselves. It's the ripple effect. And I think, as Dr. Mia said, you know, we won't give up because one should never give up where human rights are at stake. But that's why I link with the human rights situation, looking towards what could be the end game. Because while we carry on round about this in a circle condemning human rights abuses, that is very important, but it doesn't move forward to resolution. So we've got to always have these twin objectives: condemn human rights abuses, but move forward to conflict resolution. And I was very interested myself in listening to Mona Bhan's comments on, you know, the economy, the agricultural aspect. And again, this idea that, oh, well, make people prosperous and they'll forget about their political rights. Actually, that doesn't work. I mean, which is the Indian, the Indian idea, to make them prosperous. As we know, history is littered with this sort of settler colonial idea. I mean, that you just make people, economy, but you need economy and economic benefits along with political freedoms. And this is what we have to work to, because people, as I say, we're all human beings. We're all on the same planet. And I would like to talk about interfaith, because it shouldn't just be for the Muslims to highlight this because there are other Muslims suffering. It should be humanity to highlight this because people are suffering. And whether you're Muslim, non-Muslim, we should not tolerate human rights abuses. Read opening articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's for all humanity, whatever your faith, whatever your religion. So, I endorse what's being done, and we have to continue to speak out. I hope I've answered the question. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. I think that was a very in-depth answer, and definitely reiterate those statements. For Dr. Zia and Dr. Bhan, someone asked, are the older generations of Kashmiris educating their younger generations about Kashmir? I guess this could be taken in a diaspora approach as well, but if either of you would like to answer.
Samona, would you like to go? We can't hear you. Okay. So is it about the diaspora, or are people talking about the region itself?
I think they're talking about the region itself, but feel free to use whatever personal experience you have to answer.
Well, I think thinking about educating Kashmiris, younger generation of Kashmiris in what's happened, the historical wrongs or the history, is the older generation doing that? I feel like it's the younger generation also teaching the older generation at the current moment. I mean, thinking about my own generation, we hadn't studied any Kashmiri history. We knew Indian history, we knew world history, but we did not know what was happening in Kashmir, and we had to excavate those matters. We had to excavate our own histories. We had to relearn speaking and reading and writing in Kashmiri. And I think most of us still are not very successful at that. But what has happened in the last 33 years is that there's a concerted curiosity that is being catered to by these younger generations. And this rediscovery of what people, Kashmiris, have written in the last 74 years. So there was, it's not as if Kashmiris have not written or spoken or have not, gathered, despite the fact that there's always been an impediment to public assembly inside Kashmir, especially if they're talking about plebiscite, especially if they're talking about right to self-determination. As I said earlier, it was criminalized right from 1949 itself. But Kashmiris have been writing, reading, talking in courts as well, because there was always criminalization of dissent. So, but last 33 years did prove very, very beneficial for a lot of youngsters and a lot of young generation that was coming up, and now more so. And people kind of connected to their history. As Dr. Schofield said, that the more you repress people, economic prosperity is not a measure of what they have politically. So I think right now Kashmiris are really rediscovering who they are as they are being pushed to the corner. It's kind of like inversely proportional here. So they are becoming more and more conscious. And I might also add to the fact that many Kashmiris who kind of did not see their Muslimness 30 years back, now they see themselves as Muslim Kashmiris, because now India is the way India is going and the way policies are changing. So that's also connected to history and historical education that's happening inside Kashmir at the moment, and even in the diaspora. I think after 29, the diaspora is becoming more and more cognizant. They had to become overnight. They're not accidental activists, but it was an impromptu activism that happened with the entire diaspora. And everyone who, even, people who came here for education, people who came here to just do their jobs, people who were just joining, their other family or kin here, they were kind of forced together to think about what they can do and protest and come together in an impromptu manner. And I think right now, a lot of people are interested, they're reading and they're connecting to scholars and they are taking up research projects. And I think that has happened. That is a good thing that has happened in the Kashmiri community here in the diaspora and is also happening inside Kashmir. And also thinking about how is history, how does history transfer? Inside Kashmir, I don't think ever, like even in our generation, when the historical education was not primary, because there were other factors, there was a lot of state repression that was already present, the indirect violence that was already present, for lack of a better word, the structural violence that was already present before 1989, that people did not really think of a military occupation as a rubric. Even during those times, we were being educated in different ways in our history. And after that, Kashmiri kids, they are being, they get a history lesson every time they step out. And even when they're not stepping out of their homes, when they're inside their homes, within these boundaries of curfews and all kinds of crackdowns and raids and arrests are happening. So they are getting that firsthand, which is a tragedy, which is really not a good way to educate anyone, but it is a heartbreaking reality for them. So I feel that the younger generations that are born, that are being raised, they are more knowledgeable than us. They also have a lot of people who have done some groundwork and they're reading them. And I think they're far well-read than we are. But of course, it's a complementary kind of an education happening that the older generation and the younger generation is forging together. And I see those effects in diaspora as well. We're also trying to figure out like how to really come together around this. As Dr. Schofield and Mona also talked about, I think decolonization and demilitarization of the region is the most important sort of stepping stone to any kind of resolution. And I think all of us can rally together and come together for that. Of course, cessation of human rights violation, but we've also seen people lending solidarity to human rights, kind of like disassociated from how these human rights occur, as if they occur in a vacuum. And that has happened a lot with people inside India lending solidarity, that they are with you till human rights violations, but the moment you talk about political dispute, they kind of diversify and diverge from you. So I feel that most of us have to start thinking about more macro processes, which is not so macro. But thinking about decolonization, thinking about demilitarization and right to self-determination is where we can all get together, cut through the obfuscation that Indian narrative has really imposed in the last 74 years. And sadly, that is the narrative that has been bought mostly by the international audiences and other global fora. So that's kind of like connected to a little bit of the history you're talking about, that we have to bring back the slogan of decolonization. We also have to think about demilitarization. No one really needs to live the way Kashmiris are living at the moment, with so many military bunkers, and it's one of the densest, highly dense militarized zones in the world. So I think that's where we can all kind of come together and forge a future path for all of us. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I think it makes sense. A lot of Kashmiri youth are forced into activism. Thank you. So I guess as one of our couple of last questions, Dr. Bhan, I believe that you mentioned tourism in your speech. So I wanted to ask if you could speak maybe a little bit more about how tourism has a role to play in settler colonialism of Kashmir.
Yeah, sure. And I want to quickly sort of add to the previous question. I think, in a settler colonial context of occupation, I mean, people's history is the first to go, right? I mean, that's how you basically arrest people's growth and development as a community, is by literally robbing them of their history. And to Athar's point, I think it's also about what the older generation is transmitting. I mean, we also have to recognize the older generation has not had a homogenous experience, vis-a-vis the Kashmir issue. I think there are families, for example, in Kashmir who deeply, viscerally felt the brunt of occupation right from 47. There might have been others who didn't feel it in the same ways. And I think that's where we need to really keep a mind our minds open to recognizing that for a lot of people, this idea of democracy, this idea of prosperity was already deeply compromised, starting from 47 onwards, even though it might not have been felt as a collective structure of feeling up until 1989. And that includes, and this goes back to Victoria's point about how it's not about a Muslim issue, it's not about a Hindu issue, it's about how Kashmiris felt, regardless of what their religion was. And I sort of, to that point, because it's also important to recognize how our histories have been distorted because of the current climate of siege in India too, right? Where, for instance, communities in Ladakh, where I've worked extensively, or Kashmir Pandit communities, have a very different sense of that history because they narrativize that history very differently. But this is where I feel education and history is so critical, because if you go back to what actually happened from 47 onwards, there is not the slightest doubt that Kashmir was always an international dispute. I think if we just came down to that recognition, we don't have to be a Hindu or a Muslim to recognize the contours of that history. And that's where I feel an honest reckoning of that history for every community, regardless of who they are, is critical if we want to truly understand the genesis of this issue and where it's going to go. So azadi, or self-determination, that's how I see it. Self-determination is not simply the right of Muslims, it's everybody's right, but Kashmiris have been robbed of that right as a community, regardless of their religion. So, I mean, having said that, going back to your question of tourism, and people have written about this extensively, other scholars, how tourism has been an enterprise to project normalcy, in a situation of deep distress and deep conflict and deep militarization. So tourism is what sort of makes a place look pretty when its innards are, rotting, if you will. And that's unfortunately what tourism has always been. You kind of plaster this pretty face on a very gruesome reality, and that's what tourism does. And it makes the place consumable. Certain parts of that place consumable for the outsider who's there for leisure, who's there for, consuming this deeply exoticized landscape and claiming a piece of it as their own, right? So tourism becomes an extension of that colonial, settler colonial spirit, that ethic, that ethos, where you're trying to consume a place because you can consume it, you have the power to consume it. So tourism in any context is never neutral, but more so in a context of militarized occupation. It can never, of course, ever be a neutral pursuit only meant to pursue pleasure. It is about consumption, a gluttony, as I call it somewhere else. It's about gluttony. It's the settler colonial gluttony that is a full display, and especially right now when Kashmir and Indian states were struggling with COVID, you saw literally instances of people coming into that space, coming into Kashmir, completely disregarding, what their bodies could do to an already ravaged landscape, where people had already been suffering 2 years of intense lockdown, had very little access to health infrastructure, deteriorated public health services, and so on and so forth. What these alien bodies could do to themselves too because of COVID, but also then how bodies become weaponized through tourism is how I see it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers for offering your thoughts, experiences, and expertise on the abrogation of the articles 2 years ago, and also just further context on the Kashmiri occupation. For our audience, please keep Kashmir and Kashmiris in your prayers, and please also follow ICNA CSJ and the World Kashmir Awareness Forum for future events and rallies, and just updates on social media. And thank you again for joining us. Have a great, wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.